You've definitely heard the term, right? Critical race theory. It's been everywhere at the center of some really heated debates, from local school boards all the way up to state legislatures. But, beyond all the headlines, what is it really? Okay, let's get into it.
And believe me, this conversation isn't just talk. Since just January of 2021, a staggering 44 states have brought in bills or taken other steps to restrict how race and sexism can even be taught in schools. It has become a massive political flashpoint, coast to coast.
And that, right there, is the big question for this whole explainer. It's a term that's literally shaping laws in education, but the actual definition, it often just gets totally lost in all the noise. So let's try to cut through that noise and go right to the source. What do the people who actually created it say it is?
Okay, so first things first, it is absolutely crucial to understand that CRT isn't a list of rules you have to follow or some kind of specific lesson plan. Think of it more like a framework or a lens that you use to look at the world.
So at its very core, critical race theory is an academic idea that started in law schools. Scholars were wrestling with a really tough question. Decades after the Civil Rights Movement, why were so many racial inequalities still around? They started looking for answers inside the legal system itself.
Kimberly Crenshaw, one of the scholars who actually helped coin the term, has a really powerful way of thinking about it. She says CRT isn't a noun, it's a verb. It's not a bunch of facts you memorize, it's something you do. It's a practice, a way of asking some tough questions about how race works in our society.
So what are the main ideas behind this practice? Well, first, it argues that race isn't a biological fact, but a social construct. Second, it suggests that racism isn't just about a few bad apples or individual prejudice, but that it's often systemic, baked right into our laws and institutions. It also questions the whole idea of colorblind laws, arguing they can still lead to discriminatory results. Then there's intersectionality, the idea that different kinds of discrimination, like racism and sexism, can overlap and make things even worse. And finally, it really values the firsthand experiences of people of color as a critical source of knowledge.
Okay, that idea of systemic racism can sound a little abstract, so let's make it concrete. Take this quote from a 1991 Harvard Law Review article. Researchers found that even when every other factor was exactly the same, women and people of color were consistently quoted higher prices for the very same car. Now, a CRT analysis would say this isn't necessarily about one salesperson being overtly racist, but about how bias can get embedded in a system, leading to these unequal outcomes.
So where did this whole school of thought even come from? Well, it wasn't created in a vacuum. It actually grew as a direct response to a very specific problem that legal scholars were trying to figure out.
The story really gets going in the 1970s. CRT grew out of another movement called critical legal studies, but some scholars felt like that movement was too focused on class and just wasn't talking enough about race. So by the mid-80s, folks like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw started to formalize this new movement. From there, it moved beyond law schools into other areas, and then, well, in the 2020s, it just exploded into the mainstream public debate.
And this right here is the key to understanding its origins. The civil rights movement had won these huge, landmark legal battles, but major racial gaps in wealth, health, and justice, they just weren't going away. The founders of CRT were asking, why? They started asking a really challenging question. What if the legal system itself, which is supposed to be neutral, was actually part of the problem?
And knowing that academic origin is so important because it helps us understand the really deep divisions we see today. In the public arena, the whole debate is often boiled down to a simple question. Is CRT a necessary tool for justice, or is it a divisive threat to our unity?
A big reason this is all so confusing is that the term critical race theory has been stretched to mean, well, a lot of different things. In the public debate, critics often use it as a kind of catch-all phrase for everything from diversity training to just talking about racism in history, stuff that goes way beyond what the original academics were focused on.
So that brings us to the two main camps. On one side, proponents see CRT as an absolutely essential tool. They argue that you can't fix these persistent racial gaps if you don't understand their systemic roots. On the other side, critics argue that the theory is deeply divisive. They say it undermines core American ideas like meritocracy, that it pushes collective guilt, and that it ends up pulling people apart instead of bringing them together.
And this debate is not just academic, not anymore. It has led to very real political action. This brings us right back to those 44 states that have introduced bills, with 20 of those states now having actual bans or restrictions on teaching these concepts, especially in K-12 schools.
So why? Why has this one specific academic theory become the center of such an intense firestorm?
Well, it's because the debate isn't really about legal scholarship anymore.
When you peel back all the layers, the fight over CRT is really a proxy war. It's a battle over something much, much bigger. It's a fight over how we, as a country, tell the story of who we are, where we've been, and where we're trying to go.
This whole controversy forces us to face some huge questions, doesn't it? How should we teach American history? Is racism mainly a problem with individuals, or is it baked into our structures? What's the best way to move forward to a more just society? And whose stories get to be at the center of the American narrative? I mean, those are the real stakes here.
And this really drives home the disconnect. What you're seeing is the cover of a foundational text, Critical Race Theory and Introduction. And the public debate we hear today, with all the sound bites and slogans, it just feels like it's a million miles away from the dense, complex legal analysis you'd find inside a book like this.
So in the end, it all comes back to this. This is so much more than a debate about a theory. It is a fundamental debate over how we tell America's story. And that leaves us with a huge question that goes way beyond any single framework. When we tell the story of our country, what parts of that story are essential?